Sometimes when you're driving down the road all by yourself, you begin to hear a voice that tells you need to look around, pay attention. Maybe something isn't quite right. That voice is me. It's the voice of Gord. G'day everybody, welcome to another episode of Voice of Gord. Been a few weeks, I have to apologize for that. I've been very busy, all of the usual excuses apply, and none of them are very convincing. But anyway, here we are. Another apology for the show you're about to hear. We had some minor technical difficulties with the sound. I think there was an issue going on with my guest's sound rig, but it's listenable and the content is great. My guest today is Mr. Doug Lain, one of the sort of kingpins behind Sublation Media, an online magazine that critiques things from the left. We discuss the Twitter files, the sort of online discussion and out there in the media between, disinformation, misinformation, state censorship, the sort of disconnect between sort of leftist or Marxist commitments to free speech and what all these folks are up to. Obviously, that has some crossover with myself, having been booted from Twitter 3 times. And, Trudeau's interference with the internet with Bill C-11, C-18, and all the nonsense going on back in Canada. I think this was a really valuable conversation. I know part of my audience is probably not terribly interested in hearing from somebody who's a self-identified leftist, but I believe it's useful to speak with your, political antagonists or people you don't necessarily agree with, just to sort of think find out what they actually think. What's the analysis? What's the logic behind it all? Why not? We can't solve anything if we don't talk to each other. Doug and I had a great conversation. You guys are going to enjoy it. Please have a look in the show notes for where you can find Doug, Sublation Media, their YouTube channel. One of his comrades, Ashley Frawley, had me on to speak about the Freedom Convoy last year. They've been very good to me, and today I'm returning the favor. All right, so without any further delay, let's get to Mr. Doug Lain. G'day everybody, and welcome to another episode of Voice of Gord. I'm Gord, and this is my voice. The other voice you're going to hear today is that of a fairly prolific writer, commenter, podcaster, YouTuber, all-around interesting guy. Please welcome to the show Mr. Doug Lain, editor at Sublation Media. G'day, Doug.
Hey, I'm glad to be listening to the Voice of Gord. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, sir. So you are friends with Comrade Frawley.
Mm-hmm.
And
do you call her Comrade just for my benefit, or do you always call her Comrade Frawley?
No, I
that makes me feel warm inside to hear the word comrade thrown around.
I do that to wind up people of certain political persuasions that listen to my show. I remember I used the term comrade I started experimenting with LinkedIn. And I used the term, somebody read one of my Substack essays and saw that I used the term comrade in it, and just immediately went full on reactionary, boomer conservative. Who is this dirty commie I'm dealing with? He just assumed all the things, so it works. It's more for making fun. But yeah, so Ashley, she tracked me down when I was I'm sort of new at this podcasting and writing thing. I've been trucking forever, and I gained a little notoriety talking about Freedom Convoy last year in Canada. Ashley had me on her YouTube show, which I think might have been right as you guys were starting Sublation.
Yeah, no, you were on Sublation's video on our YouTube channel, but she did the interview. Yeah,
right.
We do that together often.
Right. Yeah. And so you and Ashley have quite a long history.
Yeah, she actually was one of the first, not one of the first, but she was first a guest on my podcast called Diet Soap, which I started in 2009 after the economic crisis, and I was just trying to figure out like what the hell's going on with the economic crisis. And she was, I think, in graduate school at the time, or maybe just finishing. And anyway, she had written about happiness, and she emailed me and said, "I listened to your podcast. I'd love to come on." So she came on as a guest. It was great. She was a great guest. Then when I worked at Zero Books as a publishing manager there, I brought her on as an editor at Zero Books, and then when I got shit canned from Zero Books because the company was purchased and the people who purchased it hated my guts, I started another company, and she came along to start Sublation.
Right. And so how has Sublation been received? Tell my listeners who are not all truck drivers, but there's a few. Like I say, my show's a little bit confusing. It's ostensibly about the sort of deeper issues behind what's going on in trucking labor market economics, but it's spun off in a few different directions. And so here I have, a fairly, Sublation is basically like a leftist critique magazine, as it were.
Well, there's a magazine which is run by this guy in England called Alfie Bound. He's the editor in chief of that. But then I call myself the CEO of Sublation Media, and we publish books, and we also create YouTube videos, and we create podcasts, and we're working on making a movie. The working title of the movie is "Was Orwell an Optimist?" And I would say Sublation is doing pretty well, but what considering, and what I mean by that is that the left overall, like the far left, the socialist left, had a big moment during Trump's presidency, and also like from 2016 leading into 2016 with the first Bernie Sanders campaign, and then with his second campaign in 2020. And when both attempts to create something like democratic socialism within the U.S. government failed, the left has been having the doldrums, and a lot of people are just like, I think I'll watch makeup tutorials or movie reviews or anything else. This is too depressing.
It seems like the institutional left or mainstream left, whatever you want to call it, is sort of flailing around. To your credit, I think one of your colleagues, James Smith,
Mm-hmm.
host of the Popular Pod,
Yeah.
he as well as Ashley reached out to me because people were trying to like figure out what the Freedom Convoy meant, and for many reasons, including the institutional left, such as it is in Canada, basically marching in lockstep with Trudeau and just feeding into a campaign of fear and lies and paranoia about us. There was some honest dealers such as Ashley and James looking for clarification, and they found me.
Yeah. I mean, Ashley was great in that moment. She bucked the trend. A lot of people, like, there's a magazine called Jacobin, which wrote about the trucker convoy and decided you were all petty bourgeois because you owned your own trucks, and therefore you weren't real workers and that kind of thing.
I remember that. Yeah.
And I didn't have any of it, but the reason I didn't have any of that was because Ashley was like in my face, like, that's bullshit. You can't believe that story. And overall, I think it's been made extremely clear that trucker convoy had a lot of merit and was standing on solid ground
One of the
because
I'm sorry to interrupt. One of the things about it, you are a man of the left,
mm-hmm,
and your writing oozes that. You're very open about it. You would consider yourself a Marxist.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, it took me a long time to have the confidence to say that rather than I'm a wannabe Marxist, but I've read just enough Marx to be able to fake it. But
right,
yeah, good. Mm-hmm,
right. So you sort of understand something about like organizing and spontaneity and reaction to corporate and state power coming from the bottom, from the grassroots, right?
mm-hmm,
And one of the points I made to James and to Ashley and to anybody that would listen was that the Freedom Convoy was literally started by a small handful of people, went on social media, became its own thing. It was totally distributed and decentralized.
mm-hmm.
And everybody in like the media was against it from the word go. It was later revealed at the Public Order Emergency Commission that like Trudeau's underlings and this guy Marco Mendocino, his public safety minister, was like working with the media to set up a January 6th narrative before they even got to Ottawa. And everybody in the media bought it hook, line, and sinker. And then a bunch of
Mhm.
people on the left bought it too. And the fact that like nobody could wrap their heads around it, that these were just like regular working people with a beef and having a, you know, a protest and using their rights, like it just got psyoped into this thing that it wasn't. And like here I am a year and a half later, and like I just wrote this piece in Newsweek about these guys that got arrested in Coots and how that whole story just stinks and nobody in the Canadian media will touch it. Like there's still these like after echoes of fear around discussing anything Freedom Convoy related, which I think have some parallels to what you've been saying about like the Twitter files and censorship and like your analysis of what's going on in the sort of mainstream media, the Democratic Party, all these people attached to what Curtis Yarvin calls the cathedral. And like they only speak about things in a certain way, even though reality dictates otherwise. Like they're just trying to ignore it.
Right. I mean, like if there was a group of people that only wanted to talk a certain way, I wouldn't have a problem with that. I mean, I might disagree with them, but the thing about the Twitter files, what that exposed was the way in which the US state, and actually it's happening in Canada and in Europe as well, is using its power to set up an apparatus to censor and control information and the media really throughout the West. And when I discovered that, I was kind of late to it really because it took Matt Taibbi's reporting and Michael Schellenberger's and Barry Weiss's reporting on the Twitter files to wake me up, and then watching the congressional hearing where the Democrats were just coming right out and saying, "Yeah, we love to censor people and it's necessary, and you people are Trumpists," or whatever they were calling them. That I realized, oh, this is like really serious and really bad. Like in the early 2000s, I was one of the people who protested against the war in Iraq, and I protested even more, or at least as intensely, against the Patriot Act in the United States, because I thought it was just an abomination that the federal government wanted to know what library books I was checking out. I mean, how naive is that? They know
Yeah,
fucking everything
seriously.
about me, right?
Yeah.
But I was like, I'm not gonna, if they want to know what library books we're checking out, what I did was I organized a protest where I took a bunch of people split off from a peace protest, took them to the library, and we checked out books that I had decided, written up a list that were like dangerous books, like the Anarchist Book Cookbook or Mark Twain, or just things that might be thought of as that. I looked at like books that had been censored, a list of books that had been censored, and put that on the list because I wanted to kind of get the word out that the federal government, through the Department of Homeland Security, was surveilling us and stamping on our rights. And there were a variety of ways that that was happening back then. Well, now it's continuing to happen, but it's not the Bush administration, but the Biden administration that's in charge of it. And I guess that makes a difference for a lot of people. But it doesn't for me. And so, yeah, I'm kind of like trying to sound the alarm on the left, like, hey, wake up. You're walking lockstep off a cliff here with a bunch of people who are not on your side and who are not going to help everyday working people, and who are going to create a situation, if we let them, where we're not even going to know what we don't know. We're not going to even be able to begin to muster we will maybe, but look, like Macron in France said, if there are more protests and riots like there have been recently, he'll just shut off social media altogether. What would that have done to the trucker convoy if you had just had social media completely shut down?
Yeah, well, this is the thing is since the Freedom Convoy happened, a couple of things really scared the government. One of
Mm-hmm.
which, as you say, is social media and the speed and rapidity with which the Freedom Convoy went from a very small idea between a very small handful of people to a nationwide movement. Like it went from 0 to 1,000,000 miles an hour within a couple of weeks. And then the fundraising. So notice how their reaction was to immediately seize bank accounts and whatnot,
Right.
because one of the things the Freedom Convoy did, and I think the final tally was they had raised $24 million in the space of a couple of weeks, and that total is more than the annual fundraising of some of Canada's political parties, right? So if the Freedom Convoy was a political party in 2022, they would have a bigger war chest than basically everybody else, right?
And just to kind of go over this, to remind me, but tell me if I'm getting this right. The main thing that you were all protesting was the fact that you had to be vaccinated in order to keep doing your job, right? And it was being vaccinated at a time when we already knew that the vaccines were not slowing transmission. It was after Omicron had hit, right? And you were doing a job where you weren't that exposed anyway. And it was also in the context of being surveilled in multiple ways all the time anyhow. And you just wanted bodily autonomy. Is that basically?
That's basically the crux of it. And you know, a couple of the organizers of the Freedom Convoy were truckers, like this one woman named Bridget Belton. She was just documenting being harassed at the border because the mandate was on guys and girls coming back and forth across the border, and there would have been like for 2 weeks you would have had to go into quarantine after every trip south of the border. And again, in the inquests into the Freedom Convoy and the invocation of the Emergencies Act, it was revealed there was no scientific basis or rationale for this whatsoever. There's never been a study done showing that truckers spread the virus more than anybody else. No accounting for our solitary lifestyle. No accounting for anything about anything. It was just punishment from Trudeau. And I've heard from this guy in Alberta that the pilots were never mandated in Canada to get vaccines. The companies did it themselves, but there wasn't a federal mandate. Same with boats. There was all these other like federally regulated modes of transportation where the companies did. I guess there's a distinction there, maybe without a difference. But yeah, at the end of the day, it was no scientific rationale. It's been shown and admitted by the pharmaceutical companies it doesn't prevent transmission. Other countries are already starting to open up. What is the point of this? And the point was for Justin Trudeau to flex. I mean, that's literally it. The guy's a liberal authoritarian, shiny hair, rainbow socks. But the conspiracy theory that he's the son of Fidel Castro, he
Huh.
certainly acts that way. So yeah, that's basically
But it's not just him. It's like across the board. Like with these Twitter files thing, right? And the war on disinformation. There's an effort underway to empower bureaucrats and the federal and states to be able to suppress the public, in multiple ways. And the reason why I think goes back to like the 2008. I think it goes back to the fact that there was an economic crisis that was only half managed, that was reducing the quality of life for millions and millions of people, and the state can't do much about it. And so their answer is to put their hand down on the people, keep the people from organizing against them as much as they can. And so the point was, like you said, a flex, but it's like the point was to use the crisis to create more authority for the state.
Right. Rule by crisis. It's something we've seen our entire adult lives. It's interesting you mentioned the Iraq War and the Patriot Act. I'm 44. I kind of started coming of age right around 9/11. I
Mm-hmm.
too went to anti-Iraq war protests. My sort of political philosophical journey, such as it is being an uncredentialed chud working class dude, has
Mm-hmm.
been all over the place. I was a card carrying member of the Green Party of Canada for a while. I've gone libertarian. I sort of thought Obama was pretty cool when he showed up in '08. I didn't know any better. I've been all over the show, and now I don't even know where to put my politics anymore. But not anywhere mainstream, that's for sure. But like you say, this misinformation thing, like even my wife, my wife's kind of like a Bernie supporting progressive type. The way she talks about that, she thinks it's like some kind of critical problem, that misinformation, because like my sister's husband, my one brother-in-law watches, like, crazy people on BitChute or Rumble or something. And my
Mhm.
wife thinks that's an issue that the government should somehow step in because, like,
I'm starting a Rumble channel, by the way, but not a BitChute one. But go on.
yeah, but like there's this perception that's being manufactured, and I really liked your article referencing Chomsky just because of the connection. So they're manufacturing a narrative that anybody that disagrees with that narrative or doesn't agree with them or doesn't go along with current thing enjoyment is like a misinformation peddler that has to be dealt with by the state. You mentioned George Orwell, like 1984. Anyone? Like, alarm bells should be going
Right.
off.
No, I totally agree. And I mean, the thing about this worry about misinformation is that what's changed is just the terms we use. It's always been the case that if you pick up a newspaper, it's going to be filled with what's now called misinformation. Like if you ever have known about a story firsthand and then read a news article about it, they get about half of everything wrong. And it's not even on purpose some of the time, or most of the time it used to be, because journalists have to fill in gaps. They write the story as they based on their own confirmation bias. It's always been the case that people have to think for themselves when they encounter the news. That's the whole idea of having a free press, is that you have to think for yourself.
Right.
And what the state doesn't want us doing that anymore. They don't want us thinking at all. And really, if they could avoid it, they would prefer it. I feel as though people who are concerned about disinformation and misinformation just need to drop those words and think about, being worried about when people get things wrong or when people lie to them. And people lie to them or get things wrong all the time. And we're all fallible, and not all of us are always honest. Hell, I'm not always honest. So we can deal with these problems. We don't need the state to step in, and because we know that if there's an agency that will lie to us, it's the CIA and the Department of Homeland Security and so on and so forth. They're clearly not going to tell us the truth. So we don't
Right.
want them in charge.
Right. And it's interesting too that, again, we are of a certain vintage, and
Mm, yeah. Gen X.
I remember people on the left under Bush the Younger and all the wars that got started being heavily critical of the CIA, critical of the imposition of the Patriot Act, which we're still feeling the ramifications of 20 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And, all of this critique of the government and being wary of censorship because people saw how the sort of, mass propaganda campaign in service of Bush's war functioned and were rightly horrified by it. But now, 20 years later, and a lot of the people who grew up under that seem to have been like psyoped into supporting all these very same things, but for different purposes and for a different party. Am I missing something?
I don't know if it's for different purposes, but it's definitely for a different party. Although, like one of the things that's happened in the US is that the people who were part of the Bush administration when Trump got elected, they kind of shifted over into the Democratic Party.
Oh yeah, like
The
who's the guy? I used to troll him on Twitter all the time. He's the Canadian guy, Bush's speechwriter. I'm having a brain fart
No,
now.
I don't know either.
Axis of Evil guy, David Frum.
Oh yeah, David Frum.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Frum was one of the first out the door. He's like, okay, cool. Trump's in. Trumpism is taking over the Republican Party, which means less wars and less control for us neocons to direct foreign policy. So now I have to go back to the Democrats. And that effing guy, when COVID came along, he was all over the scapegoating and outgrouping campaign against anybody that was, critical or skeptical of like the COVID management regime around the world. That dude, I am a Canadian. I live in the United States. My wife's American, but
Mhm.
like the Department of Homeland Security and Border Patrol need to go to David Frum's house and fly him to an island in the Arctic archipelago repatriate them back to Canada, but like in the realm of hungry polar bears.
Mhm.
Just drop them off somewhere and let the polar bears do their thing.
Yeah.
Fuck that guy.
Or, what you're saying is he should be sent to gulag, basically, is what you're
Yeah.
saying, to put it in Marxist terminology.
Yes, go to Gulag, David Frum. Yeah.
Yeah.
Who are some other names that like did the switch?
Oh gosh, I should know that. You know what? I'm just gonna say that because you've asked me on the spot, I can't think of any, but I know there are plenty. Um, but overall, I think it's clear that there was a reassessment of Bush himself and the Bush administration. People who thought Bush was the worst president ever were suddenly embracing him, and once Trump was in office, and I say that like I'm not a Trump fan. I don't think Trump is any kind of answer to the problems for Americans, but you know, I don't really distinguish between, like, I don't think the Biden administration or the Democratic Party is any great alternative to Trump either. So what I want to do, my primary goal in life right now is to expose the censorship apparatus, to talk about the way that this is happening, and to insist that people who say they have any kind of principles around like humanitarianism or wanting people to be more free or to have more equality, to say, look, you got to stop this. This is step one. Don't let the state control the discourse. Don't let the state control what's allowed to be said on social media or in the mainstream media.
Right. In what other ways besides the deep state, as it were, teaming up with Twitter? Like in what other ways is this apparatus functioning? Like what other things are they doing?
Well, okay, so I mean, the thing is, that's a big effort in and of itself, and it operates on a multiple levels. So they're using NGOs and computer machine learning software to monitor the internet and to create terms of the content moderation terms of service for these social media companies. So they're doing that. The other thing that they do is they actually meet regularly with media personalities and executives to discuss what's coming up in the news and to kind of prime them on how they should respond to events. Like, one of the big stories was around the Hunter Biden laptop and how the FBI had that laptop for a year before the story broke. And about a month before the story broke, they called a conference through the Aspen Institute where they ran a kind of a tabletop exercise with the hypothetical scenario being that Russian disinformation was being leaked into the press, and the story was that someone had acquired Hunter Biden's laptop, and they went through an exercise where each media executive was given a role in how to suppress the story, how to keep it from breaking nationally and internationally because it was Russian disinformation. And then, like a month after that table talk exercise, the story did break, and the story was suppressed, both in the major media and online. And that was run by the FBI in conjunction with the Aspen Institute, that tabletop exercise. And there's a whole bunch of people there, like executives from Facebook and Washington Post and New York Times. I have a list that I think Michael Schellenberger published on Twitter. So that's one of the things they're doing. They're also arresting people in the United States for their speech around Ukraine. There was a far left group, Black Socialists in Florida, that got arrested for being Russian agents because they were publishing pamphlets against the war in Ukraine, and they had taken some money from a Russian, but nonetheless, that they were only exercising their speech rights. They hadn't.
I remember I've written a couple of op-eds for Newsweek in the last year and a half,
Mm-hmm.
and I made the grave mistake of looking at the comments on one of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I as well have been accused of taking money from Putin himself simply for criticizing Justin Trudeau. sitting in my
I can see that
ramshackle.
yeah, you
I'm
look like
just,
you're living it up there in your basement.
yeah, I'm still waiting on the checks, Vlad. Like, let's go.
Yeah. Well, these people didn't take checks from Putin, but they had like, I don't know, some thousands, couple $1,000 they were given to print pamphlets or something. But the point is that their crime was their speech. And that can't be a crime, but they were arrested for that. And then the other thing to think about is, and you'll know this already probably, is that the disinformation campaign, in other words, the campaign to stamp out what they're calling disinformation, was aimed specifically after the 2020 election. It was aimed specifically at stamping out stories around uh, vaccine side effects and just around COVID in general. So for a while, if you said that COVID might have originated in a lab, that was considered disinformation, was blocked on social media. Or if you were critical of Anthony Fauci a little later on because of the way he lied to Congress, that was considered disinformation. Or if you said things like, oh, my aunt got the vaccine and she got really sick after and she had terrible side effects from it, which would have been like a true story, that was considered disinformation. Anything that made the official narrative on how to respond to COVID look questionable was stamped out by this a group out of Stanford using machine learning algorithms and a network of like portals and communicate in Slack channels and all that to communicate with social media companies. They would like send Excel spreadsheets to exile people from social media filled with names, thousands of names of people to either
Yeah, I've been
suppress
kicked off
or
Twitter 3 times, and I can't wait for a Twitter Files Canada to come out because I think,
I'm suspended from Twitter right now.
yeah, I think for at least 2 out of those 3 suspensions, the Canadian government was involved.
Mm,
I was suspended 36 hours after appearing on Fox News. They
mm.
asked me to be on Laura Ingraham's show. I mean, I understand she's a bit of a polarizing and noxious figure to some, but it wasn't like NPR was banging down my door to ask for my take. And then this most recent one, about a week and a half after I did a podcast with this woman in Alberta who's discussing the situation with these political prisoners in Canada and their ill treatment by the government, no bail, kept in remand for like 520 odd days now. A week and a half after that podcast came out, boom, suspended from Twitter again. So I'm very familiar with this. I
You
want to
sound
ask,
like you were targeted in a way that didn't make any sense. I actually got suspended for a sarcastic tweet that I kind of regret. And so, because technically read out of context, it kind of looks like I violated terms of service, maybe. But
well, this is what they do is they find that. So mine was a pretext too, like some ambiguous reply to another thread from weeks ago that was somehow what coincidental timing. But the point is like, I actually got called by the RCMP. There's this subdivision within the RCMP in Canada called the Protective Investigations Unit, which are these online sleuths who are supposed to monitor social media activity and look for legitimate threats to Prime Minister Trudeau or the cabinet and other high level officials in the Canadian government. So
mhm.
basically, the Canadian version of the Secret Service, but online. And they didn't like the way I was tweeting certain things at Trudeau. And somehow they like figured out my phone number, which is whatever. They're the deep state. They're going to get it. And they called me. I have an email from the guy in the RCMP. I saved it. Um, Constable
What did he
Clowry.
say when he called you?
He said, he actually asked, he said, listen, we know you're in the US. We know you're protected by the First Amendment down there. But would you please stop doing that? Because like every time something arises to this like threshold of a threat, we have to waste our time chasing guys like you down. And I said, have you ever heard of a website called 4chan or 8chan where like murders have actually been plotted out and like real, you guys all want to call everybody far right. Well, I'm just a guy on Twitter that makes fun of Trudeau. Like, why are you wasting the taxpayer dollars on me? I had this really weird conversation with this
Mm-mm.
RCMP agent. It was bizarre. I thought I was maybe being psyoped, but then I got an email from the guy like, What? So, between that, getting kicked off Twitter 3 times,
How'd you get
I'm
back? How'd you
just
get back on?
it's technological. You just have to change your SIM card in your phone and use a different browser on your laptop, get a VPN, and hope
But you
that
don't get all your followers back. You start
no, you
over
have to
fresh.
start over again. Yeah, you have to start over
Yeah.
again. But this is leading to a question. Well, it's not a question, it's a rhetorical question because I want to troll
I'll
some
give you a
people that might
rhetorical
be
answer
listening.
then.
All right. So you're a man of the left,
Mhm.
Marxist. Pretty sure you understand what the definition of fascism is, like the doctrinaire Mussolini, who took it from like late 19th century progressives. The state and the corporations work together to manage society, and there's very little democratic input. Like, is that the sort of one of the rough pillars of early
Yeah, I said
fascism?
that's roughly right. Yeah. Mhm.
Right. Okay. So in Canada, at least, I don't want to speak to the U.S. because it's such a huge thing, but like in Canada, we have Justin Trudeau working with the pharmaceutical companies and working with the media to do the same things: suppress information, kick people off social media, deny them their access to be able to speak their minds. And then they built this ArriveCan app thing to basically surveil people's health. Then they barred anyone from public transport that did not have a health pass. Where did we hear this before? So we have all of this like legit analogs to old school fascism happening before our very eyes.
Mhm.
But if you stood up to it, like me or any of the other Freedom Convoy people, we got labeled fascists for
Mhm.
standing up to surveillance, literal medical apartheid, preventing people from traveling, preventing people from accessing stores, living their lives, having jobs, being fired over a medical decision. And then we're getting chased down by the cops for airing our opinions. Help me out here. Like, what was I seeing? What do we call fascism today? Some people call it corporatism. In 2023, this connection between big tech, social media platforms, the media, the deep state, the FBI, RCMP, all the pharmaceutical companies. Like, what do you call that today? Is this not fascism? Is it just corporatism? Like, what do we call this beast?
In reality, I'll give you a serious answer. I think that what we're dealing with is a kind of new form of neoliberal totalitarianism. It's not really the same as old style Mussolini fascism. It's just a different era, and the aesthetic of it is very different, and it's global, right?
Yeah, no,
Instead of
the aesthetic is actually worse. I would prefer Mussolini fascism, like everybody wearing Hugo Boss and not looking like a fucking freak would be pretty cool in my eyes. But hey,
yeah, all right. Well, to each their own on that front. People can dress how they like, as far as I'm concerned. But yeah, but yeah, I would just call it straight ahead like progressive state capitalism. State capitalism is what I would call it first, and then I would say it's like progressive totalitarianism. And by that I mean, by the way, like the progressive movement was was the enemy of socialism in the early 20th century. Progressive movement was the movement to try to create, like, rather than making sure everybody had a job and everybody had the right to vote and everybody had the kind of freedom they needed to organize politically, the progressives came along and said, well, we'll give you these handouts, we'll make the set up these poverty schools, and we'll take care of everything for you, rather than you being free to decide what kind of government or what kind of workplace you wanted to be in. So the progressives were the enemy of the socialists, and in the early 20th century, and they still are today. They're still our enemy. They're, in my opinion, the so-called progressives. I think they fair to call them progressives, are the enemy of the socialists, and that's the first thing that if you're on the left and you call yourself a socialist, you need to understand. Um, the only place that freedom's going to come from is organizing working class people to take freedom for themselves. It's not going to come from some state bureaucrat passing a policy to liberate, or like something like UBI or something like that. That's not freedom. That's not what socialism is about.
Right. So, from your position, where
My,
you're
my
looking at this,
from my little room here next to my unmade bed. Yeah.
well, you brought up UBI, and so the name of my Substack is Autonomous Truckers.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a working class person, always have been, born to working class people who were born of working class people who were born of working class people who were previously probably peasants.
Mm-hmm.
And I drive truck for a living, and everyone's talking about those jobs being automated away. It's not unique to trucking, there's automation all over the place. And one of the suggested solutions to that from some quarters, made most famously by Andrew Yang in the 2020 campaign, I think, or was it 2016?
No,
No,
2020.
UBI.
Mm-hmm.
And UBI sounds an awful lot like a handout. Here, take this and shut up. We're just going to keep managing things, and
Mm-hmm.
don't worry about any meaning you derived from your work. Don't
Mm-hmm.
worry about any of the unknown social upheaval and disillusion that might take place by us just handing everybody free money. Like, where do you come in on UBI automation? What's coming down the pipe, or what's
I
marketed to be coming down the pipe?
Well, I think that automation is a serious problem in for the economy. Like it brings on its own crisis. Like you automate everything, everything gets cheaper, and then it's harder to make a profit, and that drives the economy into a crisis. And the way to get through that is to change the fundamentals of how we produce things and on what basis. But as far as UBI itself goes, it was originally a right wing policy. The aim of it was to just kind of give enough subsistence wages to squelch up, unrest. It would never be able to do much more than that. You're not going to be able to create a universal basic income that is actually a living income. Yeah, I think UBI is a false promise, and it will have just on the level of like pumping fiat currency out into the economy, as to use the language of the right, or to put it differently, just by pumping a lot of money into the economy, all you're going to be doing is creating inflation, and it won't be resolving the problem of profitability that's underlying the economic problem. So no, I don't think UBI. I think UBI and MMT, which is the modern monetary theory, is both. Those are both false promises from progressives to keep things the same, keep workers in the same place that they are now, and still promise to fix the problems that these people aren't going to be able to fix. All they can do is kick the can down the road, suppress people enough to stop any kind of resistance or organized politics from the working class from emerging. Hope that and hold on to their hats till the next crisis comes along, I guess. Hold on
Right?
to their
Yeah.
hats. What the hell's wrong with me? But anyway, go ahead.
Rule by crisis. So the looming automation, what to do with the working class, and these control mechanisms that they're trying to impose, like you say, trying to control what people think, using misinformation as a pretext. There's a few people I've spoken with who see this model of crisis management being used to justify the next crisis, which apparently is the climate. The sky gods must be appeased in some way. And when everyone has finally, COVID's finally petered out, or the misinformation thing has petered out, what is that? That seems to be the next crisis.
I think the next crisis is going to be people like you and me. That's the crisis that they have now. That's the disinformation crisis, and the bad thinkers out in the world, the domestic terrorists. That's what is going to be the next target to justify the new authoritarian laws. And climate change is so slow boil on climate change. But the war in Ukraine is also the next crisis. Making sure that we don't get inundated with that Russian propaganda around the war in Ukraine. That's another crisis that they're using to justify censorship. So yeah, they'll invent whatever they need to continue to hold on to power. but I do think climate change is being used that way. I actually also think climate change is a real problem, but the remedies for it are not the ones that are often embraced by the left. Like, I think we should have nuclear power. Ashley convinced me of that today yet again, and I think that all too often people who are working class people who don't have a lot are asked to tighten their belts yet again, pay more for fuel, pay more taxes to fight the climate crisis in a way that will never really work. But
Well, no, because it ends up becoming like money for crony projects, and
oh yeah,
it's interesting you mentioned how it's used and it's felt most by working people. Like I have no I have no position on climate change. I'm not a I don't understand earth sciences. I'm not, I have no position one way or the other on the
I just
actual thing.
noticed it's getting hotter every year. You
Right.
know, I just noticed it. I've been living in Portland for like 30 years, and the summers are hotter for longer. And I hear things like the ice caps are receding, and I've been hearing about global warming since I was 20. So I kind of figure it's probably true roughly. But I also
Sure.
think it should be debated.
Sure, it should
Nothing's
be
ever.
debated, but yeah, exactly. Well, if skepticism is considered misinformation, there will be no debate. But like I
Right.
say, my issue with it is like the devil is always in the details. One of the things that the climate alarmist atmosphere, pun intended, has done to my business, to the trucking industry, is everyone's worried about diesel exhaust emissions. Okay, fair enough. What are ways we could cut back on them? Well, instead of like doing things to make the infrastructure upgraded, build the highways and bridges to like a higher standard, increase the efficiency of trucks, keep them moving so like they're not waiting at docks all the time, wasting drivers' time for which we usually don't get paid. Maybe have higher capacity trailers.
You
There's
don't
all
get paid for when you're at a dock. You
well,
got to.
most of the time, no, there's a whole lot of unpaid detention time in the trucking business, which also
No,
causes more accidents because waiting time actually fatigues you more than actually driving. But like, that's a whole another thing. I don't want to go down
that
that rabbit
sucks,
hole.
man.
It does, it does. But
Yeah.
here, the point I'm getting at is like the fixation on technology, right? Like they wanted the trucks to reduce emissions. Okay, great. But instead of doing systemic stuff, making necessary systemic changes to help reduce energy consumption and therefore
Hmm.
reduce emissions, that was never really been on the table. So they just like the tech bros show up and say, "Oh, we have this cool thing we can like put on your truck and it'll help reduce emissions." Except the cost of that is borne by the truck operator and the driver and the downtime when they break down because they're super fragile emission control systems. You have to put this diesel exhaust fluid in them, and every iteration, every new emissions target that they put on the engine manufacturers makes the engines more complicated and more prone to breaking down. And the
Hmm.
cost of all that is borne by the people that own and drive the trucks, lost
Hmm.
weight. Like trucking is a very narrow profit margin business, and when you're spending all this money on repairing equipment to appease the climate gods, that's not money that I'm getting in a raise. That's not money for pensions or benefits or anything. The climate stuff has literally hamstrung the trucking industry in North America. I don't know if anyone's ever done studies on this, but like I would really like to see one that like showed, the climate alarmism, draw a line over to workers getting fucked, because I have witnessed this in my own career, in my own life over the last 15 years, and nobody ever talks about that part of it. Like, never mind the increased fuel costs for people heating their homes and the stuff that people do get, but there's like all these little details about what happens in order to try and fight the climate change. Well, who has to bear that cost? I do.
Hmm.
you know and what did I do wrong? Nothing. Like, and why was there never like a bigger picture? Let's have other solutions to, if we acknowledge the problem as such, let's figure out a way so that the cost is not being borne by any one particular sector or working class people, and it's being distributed in some other way, or the emissions are being managed in a different way by making systemic changes. And that's just never happened. There's like a fetishization for tech at whatever cost, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't know if that like
No, that makes sense to me. I agree. Basically, I don't have anything to say and to elaborate on that. Just like it sounds, you sound right. But I guess the question is like, why are they always passing it on to the worker rather than taking up the cost themselves? And I would think that one of the reasons why is because the economy itself is kind of weak. Neoliberalism, this long management strategy that took hold in the late 70s until today, is a reaction to economic pressures within, that develop naturally out of or develop through the contradictions within capitalist production itself. So when you have low profitability, that limits the power of both corporations and the state. They don't want to invest in big infrastructure projects that they can't necessarily make a profit on down the road. They want to pass that down to the smallest level, to the least powerful player they can, and make you eat it. And you're replaceable. So that if the making you bear the cost of trying to do some small thing to help the climate puts you out of business, well, they'll find somebody else. But if the whole company invests in these big projects to revamp the roads and the infrastructure, there's no guarantee that that's going to lead to more profits for these companies later on, or that the state will be able to bear the costs either without more fiscal crisis. So they're always just trying to push the problem around. But there's something like fundamentally wrong in our whole system, and they can't. And it just gets, because of that, the easiest thing to do is always just to push it down onto the public, onto the people, onto the workers.
right. And you've mentioned kicking the can down the road. There's quite a few people, myself included, who are, maybe incorrect, but view what's happening in the wider economy now as a function of 2008 getting kicked down the road.
No, I
And
totally agree with that. Yeah,
do
for
you
sure.
do you think it's deeper though? Like, are these other crises that have been kicked down the road like pre 2008? Like, do you think it's older?
Yeah, I think, because I'm a Marxist, right? I think that capitalism itself tends to produce these crises, and it solves it through like bankruptcy and depression and war and destruction, which cheapens everything. And so that then the people who are left standing can come in, buy up what's left that you can produce with, and for a time there's a boom because the cost of production is devalued, so that you can then make a profit again. So like that's what happened after World War II. So you had this big economic crisis. The solution was World War II and the massive devaluation of capital. People could come in, buy it up cheaply, and for a time, it was cheap enough to produce things that they could create a good profit rate off of that. But then, as capitalism got more successful, they could produce things faster and faster. The profit rate per unit went down, and you had another economic crisis. But we didn't want to have another world war, so we implemented neoliberalism, massively financialized, creating huge balloons of debt that every once in a while will pop. And like the 2008 crisis was an example of that, in a big systemic way. And where did that all go? It went into the state. It went into quantitative easing and a huge amount of expenditure. Our debt level in the United States just went way up, and it was already huge after 2008. And then COVID created similar conditions. So the problem is systemic, and the solution is based on class war. This is the way I look at it. So they're always going to be trying to suppress workers to overcome these crises, and the workers eventually will push back. But unless there's an organized effort to push back and change the system, it's just going to keep being the same cycle over and over again. That's my Marxism for you. And I don't know, that's not me saying that, what we need is the Soviet Union to come in and control everything so we can overcome capitalism. That won't work. In my opinion, Soviet Union was capitalist. It was state capitalist. I don't know. The workers will have to transform the way work is done on some fundamental level. That's what Marxists believed anyway back in the 19th century. And I still believe it today that working people should run the world. And certainly they should run their own activity. They should be in charge of how they reproduce society because they're the ones doing the work.
What would you say, or what do you think Marx would say? Because one of my little things that bothers me a bit, being in the position I am as a trucker, is
Mm-hmm.
that you use the term neoliberalism a lot, and
Yeah,
part of that
I
whole
lean on that word pretty heavy.
right, and part of that whole project, I guess, is this new order where, like, in the 70s and 80s, production was shipped to Mexico, China, all around the world, and now we have this globalized economy where labor differences in labor pricing is leveraged and
Mm-hmm.
jobs sent, and we've seen, the working class, such as it is in North America, decimated from its former powers, but the workers here, the jobs here that couldn't be moved overseas, one of them is trucking. And one
Mm-hmm.
of my projects is documenting the ways in which they've applied the same principle while we're still here, either through bringing in lots of labor from other countries or coaxing what Marx referred to as the lumpen proletariat off their butts and into the seats of trucks, whether or not they're qualified to do it. And all of these different methods of debasing the labor value of truckers so that they could get the same savings out of us without us actually being moved offshore. Right. So
So
like
that like
I'm
so are
curious.
these
I'm
go
curious what
ahead.
the Marxist take is on like attacking workers with like labor from other places or threat thereof.
Well, when Marx wrote about it, and I have to try to remember what he actually said as well as I can, but when Marx wrote about it, he was talking about workers in England being undermined by Irish workers. They would bring in these Irish workers or they would move the workplaces into Ireland to find cheaper labor markets and undercut the power of the British workers. But he was also writing at a time when there was a lot of uprising and revolutionary struggle. So his what he said was, the way for British workers to break free of the chains from the British capitalists was to help the Irish in their revolution, to help empower the Irish workers so they could create better conditions for themselves. And that was so he saw it as the working class in England and the working class in Ireland having a common struggle, and that as when the capitalists were winning, they were set against each other. And I think that's basically true now. Like if you have these immigrants come in to do trucking, the struggle should be to make sure that no one can get hired at under a certain wage, that a living wage or whatever the standard you can win for native workers is just applied to across the board. Um, so then that undermines their ability to use immigrant labor to undermine your wages and your power. And that what I think would be the basic Marxist approach to that, is organizing both native and immigrant workers in the same fight. Yeah.
Okay.
But what do you think of that? Does that sound reasonable? Too
I'm
idealistic?
it doesn't seem to have worked in practice, although I'm not sure anybody tried it that way. We have these indentured servitude agreements that like are a function of the trucking industry in Canada now, where like Indian trucking companies bring their homeboys over from the Punjab, often illiterate. There was a huge report revealing all of this in 2019, which Trudeau's done nothing about. And if your threat of being sent back to India, and there's these ways they leverage Like here you are in Canada or America now. Similar programs have been going on in the U.S. specifically with like port truckers down in Los Angeles. USA Today did a big thing on that a few years ago. These companies make these promises to people from other countries: come to North America, come to the US, come to Canada, you're
Mm-hmm.
going to have this better life. And then those promises aren't delivered on at
Mm-hmm.
all. They just end up working for garbage money here and then having their visa owned by some company or some dude, and the race to the bottom carries on. It's shifted locations, and it's undermined the people that are already here. I mean, it would be good if, labor minimums were maintained, but they never are.
Right. I mean, like, I don't know why, like, I don't know the details. Right. And so I'm just talking in the abstract, like this is what Marx would think should be done. But we're not living in the revolutionary moment. Labor isn't organized the same way. So if I wouldn't want to come into a labor struggle and say, hey, do what Marx said. I would want to say, hey, what the hell is going on first and figure it out. But I do think that that idea of the united working class struggling together is going to always be more powerful than different factions within the working class thinking of themselves as having different interests.
Right. I'm going to switch gears on you here real quick
Okay.
because I want to get somebody that's knowledgeable about the difference between Marxism and the sort of the results of the Frankfurt School people. I want some
Oh, I know a
clarification
little
on
bit
this.
about Frankfurt School. Yeah. Go
Right.
ahead.
So there's a lot of like commentators on the right. I follow a lot of that stuff. I pay attention to a lot of like people, quote unquote, on the far right, whatever the hell that means.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the sort of normie cons, people like Jordan Peterson or Ben Shapiro, Marxism this, Marxism that. And they're talking about cultural issues, the like,
Mm-hmm.
gay this, tranny that,
Mm-hmm.
drag queen story hours, all the culture wars stuff. And they keep blaming all that on Marx. And
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, my readings of Marx, limited as they are, he seem to be pretty strictly focused on economics, working class stuff, and then all of this, the sort of culture war narratives, and then the way that like the mainstream left, the people you've been fighting with, Twitter files and trying to get these people to wake up and see what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you like, there was that famous essay by Marcuse about
Repressive
like,
tolerance.
yeah, the paradox of intolerance, or you don't
Mm-hmm.
tolerate intolerance or whatever.
Yeah, repressive tolerance is, I think, the name of it. Yeah, and I just read that again. Actually, maybe for the first time, I actually read it last week because I had a guy on my podcast to talk about Marcuse. It's an interesting read. It's not quite as clear cut as people think it is. I don't think it's a great essay by him by any means.
It's not very long either,
No, it's not very long. That's why I could read it right before the interview, right?
but
And
very
actually,
influential though. That essay was has it's been extremely influential in how the quote unquote mainstream left, Democrat left, the sort of left you're not associated with, like how that functions. Like, do I have that correctly?
yeah, I think they definitely picked it up, and I think it's both been picked up by lately by some people on the left who want to justify what's going on with the war on disinformation. And but I think that Marcuse and his supposed censoriousness, I think there's something to it in that essay. Has also just been a handy villain for people on the right as well. So I read the essay, and he definitely he's a Marxist first. Marcuse. He was also influenced by Freud and psychoanalysis. He was influenced by a guy named Heidegger, but he was a Marxist. And so what that meant was he did want to create a free society. He wanted people, working class people, and all people to be free from oppression and exploitation, and free to be productive and then gain the benefits from that. But he saw after he was German, he escaped from the Nazis, right? The Frankfurt School philosophers fled the Nazis, and he was very upset and concerned about how fascism and Nazism had risen up in Europe, and it had risen up, really right after a failed attempt at revolution in Europe. Specifically in Germany, there had been in 1918 and 1919 an attempt to create a socialist revolution, and it had been flattened. And then after that, 10 years after that or so, there was the fascism started to take hold. And he was writing about tolerating reactionary movements and the problem with tolerance in terms of tolerating fascism. And what he said, though, was that fascism was what you said. It was when the state and capital merge, and that the kind of propaganda and distorted ideology and so-called false consciousness that shouldn't be tolerated always could be tracked back to the state, to the capitalist state. So when he was saying we shouldn't be tolerant of propaganda and reaction, he was talking about reaction he saw as coming out of the state, not coming out of the public, and not some
Right. Well,
grassroots.
the funny thing again with today's discourse
Well,
is
let me just get to the end of this thought,
right,
because
right.
that means that like you can't turn to the state and ask them to repress properly to get rid of the stuff that shouldn't be tolerated. He wouldn't have been supportive of this war on disinformation for that reason. So what is he talking about? It's like, basically, you see a fascist in the street, you might have to take up a baseball bat. If you see people organizing to take state power and put people into camps, you should take up arms, or you should at the very least tell them to shut up and get out of your neighborhood.
So Herbert Marcuse would have been on the side of the Freedom Convoy after Justin Trudeau medically apartheiding Canadian society
Well,
and not
maybe
allowing them to
I would
travel
like
or
to.
work.
People are sometimes hypocrites, right? I mean, but I would like to believe that Marcuse would be on the side of the Freedom Convoy. Absolutely, yeah. But what he would actually do, who knows? People who had really good ideas when they were young, or better ideas anyway, like Angela Davis, it didn't turn out so great. She got older, and so who knows what he would have actually done. But yeah, if he had been sticking to what he actually wrote, he
So
certainly would have been on the
speaking
side
of
of
someone getting older and their ideas circling the drain somewhat, you had this essay citing Mr. Noam Chomsky,
mm-hmm.
who very famously went on a podcast and said, anybody that refuses the vaccine need to be treated like lepers, and
That was on my. He said that on my podcast too.
oh, no shit.
Yeah, yeah. And you know what I said to him? I said, "Well, look, my son is like phobic of needles. Like, I've taken him to get vaccinated like 3-4 times, and he ends up rolling around on the floor. We can't get him vaccinated. What should we do about him?" He was like, I guess maybe an exception in his case." Yeah. But anyway, yeah, he did say that. And you know what I chalk that up to is, like, he was in an incredibly vulnerable population. Like, he's what, 95, 94?
Well, he is who the medical authorities and the COVID regime should have been concentrating and focusing their efforts on, instead of trying to harangue young people who had like a 99.997% of surviving COVID.
Yeah, man, I think I mostly agree with that. Like, I don't know where the cutoff would be, like when it was, like, certainly if you're under the age of 16, there's very little reason for you to, seems to me, there's very little reason for you to be too concerned about getting vaccinated. And they certainly shouldn't have been sending people who had COVID back into nursing homes to expose everyone else. But yeah, I totally agree. But yeah, it's sad. I like Agamben. Have you ever heard of? I didn't know about him until recently, really. But Agamben is this European kind of post-Marxist type, and he was like, "Look, there are values that are more important than health, like freedom, and and so we shouldn't be turning over all our authority to the state to lock us in our homes."
Right. And there's a connection with the sort of this term I've become acquainted with in the last couple of years called safetyism. where it's safety at all costs, and bureaucrats, technocrats, experts, you know, assuming roles within the state and the management of society to determine what is safe and not safe, and then limit your life based on that. And like, safety isn't a goal and an end of itself. There's no guarantee of anything in life. And if safety
Well, there is.
means,
We're all going to die. That's
yeah,
guaranteed.
yeah. But like, at some level, there's more to life than like just feeling safe. And
Right. Yeah.
and I wonder, again, you're a Marxist, not that you would speak for Karl Marx, but like, I wonder, where's the Marxist critique come down on safetyism, rule of technocrats, experts, the credentialed, professional managerial elite, in their invocation near constantly these days of what is safe or not safe, and then how that is to like percolate through all bureaucratic processes and limitations on what you can do.
I don't know what I mean. I don't think Marx wrote about the safetyism quite, but like clearly, this is a guy who thought that revolutionary struggle was gonna have to be part of the picture to create conditions of freedom. And yet, when he wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, there was a European-wide revolutionary struggle going on to overthrow the monarchies and institute republicanism in Europe. And it didn't succeed right away. It took a long time for that to finally fully take hold until after World War II for most of Europe to be Republican. But, in the sense of everyone had a nation state, were enfranchised, or weren't, the absolutism was overturned. But yeah, Marx was not walking around looking for a safe space and wanting to pet a kitten. But the other thing I would say is that he also didn't hold with the idea of there being some brilliant expert class that needed to dictate to everyday people how life should be led. He had a confidence that working people would be, would advance society ultimately, that they were the only ones that could like bring this revolutionary moment that started, let's say, in America with the American Revolution, or in France with the French Revolution, or what that was trying to take hold across Europe in 1848 when he wrote the Communist Manifesto. He said, like, ultimately, this is only going to be fully realized when workers take power, and when everyday people in civil society are able to be self-directed and free. If there's going to be a state, it should be always subservient to the public, to the people, and hopefully it will wither away and won't be even necessary at all.
Right, and not the other way around, as is currently
Where the people
formulated.
wither away and we all turn into fucking deep fakes.
Yes, there's plenty of fakery around. How deep it is another question.
Yeah.
Oh, Doug Lain, any more thoughts, sir? You've been very generous
No,
with
no,
your
no,
time.
no. I've enjoyed talking to you. I always I like talking to. I'm comfortable talking to people who are professors and things, because then I don't have to pretend to know anything. Like, I can just ask them the questions. That's generally what I do. So you asking me as an expert was a little uncomfortable. It's like, oh, what did Mark say? But otherwise, I really enjoyed it, and I really think it's important for people on the left like myself to get our heads straight and realize, like, when people want bodily autonomy and not to have the state, break its own laws to put down a protest, that our job, what we're there for, the reason we exist at all, is to like critique the powerful and try to help people who are struggling for their own freedom. So I'm glad to have been on your podcast today, and
Well,
hopefully I
and another
made the
thing,
left. I hope I made the left look a little better than we
yeah,
do right
well,
now.
and on the bodily autonomy thing, like your recent project, part of your body is your mind, and they're
Mm.
trying to tell you what you can or cannot put in or out of it with this misinformation stuff, right? So like, it's a good sign to me that like there's a few honest leftists around going, "Hey guys, like there's a problem here."
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, yeah. What's there's a thing in Sweden called yeah, it's a Swedish psychological defense agency, right? So they think that your psychology needs to be defended by the state, like they need to protect you from bad thinking. And what is it? It's another agency. This one in Sweden. Their aim: control what's said online, control what's said in the media, stamp out so-called disinformation. But they're calling it the Psychological Defense Agency. I don't see how that could be any more Orwellian,
Yeah,
than that.
and, and perfect. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, you know?
Right? Yeah. Do you remember when Bush had that when he had started the project for total information awareness, and
Yes.
he made a logo? It was like a pyramid with an
Yeah, with the
eye that
eye
was,
on top. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, it was
yeah.
like scanning the world. That shit hasn't stopped. It just, it now it talks about, diversity and intersectionality at the same time that it's scanning. So
Rainbow Sauron. Doug Lain, where can people find you?
you go to sublationmedia.com to find out the stuff that we're publishing. You can go to YouTube and look up Doug Lain, or you could look up Sublation. That's spelled Sublation. You can go on Amazon, type in my name, and buy a copy of my now 5-year-old book, Bash Revolution. I'm not on Twitter. You can't find me there anymore. But I'm on Facebook. You could look me up on Facebook, Douglas Lain.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Doug. You and I will continue to share bunks in Twitter gulag.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right.
All right, man. Way of the road.